Recording. Perfect, it's recording. So hello everyone, welcome to our next session, Canvas and Web Accessibility with Latch, presented by Adrian Rodriguez, Instructional Design Specialist at Barstow Community College. During this presentation, Adrian will discuss how Barstow teaches accessibility compliance using their acronym LATCH. This is a three-part session. So first, it'll begin with Barstow College presentation, followed by MiraCosta College, and end with a Q&A session for both colleges. So please hold out questions to the end. So without further ado, let's get started. Adrian, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. I am Adrian Rodriguez. I'm one of 3 instructional design specialists at Barstow College. And let me go ahead and get started by sharing my screen. Bear with me because I always manage to pick the wrong one and I don't want to do that. So I think we should be good to go. Okay, so as stated, this is a presentation on web and specifically Canvas accessibility using our acronym LATCH. Now I know we've taken some liberties with the spelling of LATCH, what with the 3 L's and the 2 C's, but I'll explain why that is in just a moment once we get started. So just as a little background, at Barstow College, we kind of introduce this concept and give kind of a beginner's training on accessibility in an optional training course that our faculty and staff are able to sign up for. We've recently changed the name of this training course to ASL, which stands for ADA Compliance and Equitable Delivery with Instructional Technology. So you can see why we had to shorten it to ASL. It's a pretty long title. So we offer this course once per semester. Like I said, faculty and staff are welcome to sign up. It is not a required course, but it's optional for anyone who'd like to take it. Our training focuses on ADA compliance in Canvas, and we also touch on Word and PDF accessibility. Our director plans during our next session to add guest speakers from our college as well. So starting this semester, we're going to have our PIO talk about web compliance. And we're also going to invite the Access Department to speak about student accommodations. And we promote the course. Our department promotes it, the PIO, the Access Department, Student Success and Equity. So we're really trying to get the word out about this course so that as many people who would like to take it are able to. So that's just a little background. Now, here's where LATCH comes in. So our director thought up this acronym by thinking about a latched door. So let's begin our discussion of ADA compliance by thinking about a latched door. Let's pretend that on the other side of that door is all the knowledge you need to pass a class. You stand in front of the door and wonder how everyone else is getting in and out, never realizing you didn't get to read the email that told you how to open the door. Frustrating, definitely frustrating. So we're just envisioning this door, students who need accommodations. If we don't give them the accessibility tools that they need, then they're essentially locked out. They can't get to the knowledge they need. So that's kind of how LATCH came about. So what is LATCH? What does it stand for? So we teach these basic principles of accessibility in Canvas, and they are linearization, links, lists, alt tags, tables, closed captioning, colors, and headers. So these are the areas we focus on. For Canvas accessibility, we want to make sure everyone is utilizing these components of Canvas the correct way. So let's get started with the first L, which is linearization. So linearization is basically reading order. It's how the content is presented on a page. If a student is using a screen reader, the reading order is very important. If it's out of order, the screen reader will present the content in a way that makes no sense. So content should flow logically up and down and left to right. This is usually not a big problem in Canvas. You rarely will run into linearization issues in Canvas, but just keep in mind if you're creating flyers in maybe in Word or in Publisher, you definitely want to make sure you're checking your reading order. And I always like to include this example of really bad linearization for anyone who's seen the show The Walking Dead. This door to me clearly reads "Don't Dead, Open Inside," which makes absolutely no sense. They were clearly trying to say "Don't open, dead inside," but I don't know who made that call, but that just, it doesn't make sense to me. So I would definitely want to fix the reading order there. So that's pretty much all linearization is. It's just a fancy word for how your content is presented in what order. So the next L is links. So the display text of your link should be concise. You don't want a link that's a whole sentence long. Generally, 1 to 5 words will do the trick. Links should never be hidden. So I've seen examples of this with maybe just an asterisk, and someone has linked just that asterisk and it's almost impossible to see. So we don't want to do that. We want to make sure the link is easily identified. Generally avoid using the URL as a link. So it's normally better to add display text that's not a big long URL. There are certain situations where that's okay. For example, our Barstow College's web address is just www.barstow.edu. That's short and simple. So if you wanted to just leave the URL as the link there, that would be okay. Also, if your page is going to be printed, obviously students can't click on a link that's on a printed piece of paper. So if you're needing students to access a link from a printed document, they'll want the whole link typed out so that they can type it in. Images must use alt text to describe the link. So if you have a picture and you want students to be able to click on it to go to a website, you want to make sure you've got alt text there. Links should be underlined and look distinctive. So I've got an example on the bottom here. So this is a link to our distance education page on our website. It's a really long link. So I added display text to just state BCC Distance Ed. It's much shorter, more concise. It explains exactly where you're going to go if you click on the link. So this link would definitely be preferred as opposed to using this entire URL. Okay, let's move on to our next L, which is lists. So for lists in Canvas, there's some do's and don'ts that we recommend you remember. You can use lists to define key terms and concepts, organize like information, outline numbered steps, add additional information links. You want to use headers to break up long lists. You don't want to use lists just to draw attention. Now I've seen lists where essentially every bullet point is just a sentence in a paragraph, and that's really not the meaning of a list or the list tool. So you want to avoid that. You shouldn't group unlike information with a list. Don't create unnecessary sublevels. Don't use customized bullets. Don't add extra hard returns, and don't manually create a list. So by manually, we mean don't just type a 1 period space and then start listing off your items. You definitely want to use the list tool that's in the rich content editor or your word editor, whatever program you're in, you want to use the list tool. So let's move on. Okay, so alt tags. Every image that you post to your Canvas page or to the web, whatever document you're working with, should have alt text. Again, this goes back to students who are using screen readers. If students aren't able to see the image, then the alt text is going to tell them what it is that's displayed on the page. So if you have a decorative image that doesn't add to the content of whatever you're presenting, you can just mark it as a decorative image or use this empty alt tag that's displayed here. It may be just, maybe you like flowers and you put a picture of flowers at the top of your lecture. So it's nice, but it doesn't necessarily add to the lecture content, so it would just be decorative. So images may also be described within the text surrounding the image. So if your alt text is getting out of hand, it should be no more than 120 characters. So if you need further description of the image, then you can certainly type that in around the image. Alt text should not be redundant. So this is a big one. I see this commonly happen when people, for their alt text, say image of flowers. Well, that's redundant. We don't need that, because when a screen reader comes upon an image, it will say image of. So if you've included image of in your alt text, then the screen reader will say image of flowers. So those aren't necessary. And then when creating alt text, it is important to consider content and function. Okay, tables. So I see tables pretty commonly used in Canvas. So tables do need a caption. They absolutely need a caption. That way students with screen readers know what the table, what information it's presenting. You'll need at least header rows and maybe columns, and we'll get more into that later. You want to use percentages and not pixels for the table width. And again, we'll get more in depth on why that is a little later. You don't want to nest data tables, so you don't want a table within a table. Don't leave the upper left-hand corner cell blank. So if you're using a table with header rows and header columns, oftentimes there's a blank upper left-hand cell, or an upper left-hand cell that isn't part of the header row or column. So you would just want to write some descriptive information in there. And this is, don't use more than 5 columns. I think in certain cases, you may end up with more than 5, but you don't want to get too out of control with how many columns and rows your table has. All right, so closed captioning. So any video that's posted must include accurate closed captioning, and that's to accommodate viewers with hearing impairments. So if you're creating your own video, for example, in Canvas Studio, you'll want to make sure to generate the captions and then go in and correct them where necessary, because auto captioning is imperfect. It's pretty good, but it's not perfect. So anytime you're generating your own captions, you want to make sure you're going in and correcting them where necessary. Use upper and lowercase letters, just as if you were typing a lecture. You don't want your captions to just be, run-on sentences, no uppercase. You want to make sure it's typed out nicely, and you want to preserve and identify slang and accents. Ooh, getting ahead of myself. You don't want your captions to obscure essential video elements, so you don't want it covering up important information that you've got on your screen. Again, don't forget to check them for accuracy, and also don't forget to add non-speech sounds. So if you've got maybe music that's important that your students know it's there, or laughter, or any sort of sounds that aren't speech, you can include those in square brackets. Okay, now color. I'm boring. I like to keep it really simple. I like a nice black text on a white background. You can get a little more fun than that if you'd like to. There's just some things to remember if you do choose to use color. You want a dark text if you've got a white background, which, we all know the Canvas rich content editor's white background. So you want to keep with dark text. If you're using color, we recommend 14-point bold font or 18-point font if it's not bold. That's not an absolute, the accessibility checker won't flag it if it's not 18-point, but it's just a recommendation. So don't use color as the sole indication of an important element. So for students who can't see color, they're not going to realize that what you're trying to emphasize as important is important because they don't see it correctly. So if say you have an essay that's due Saturday and you really want to emphasize that it's due Saturday, don't just use color to emphasize that fact. So I wouldn't just put in red text, due Saturday. I would also make it bold, make it italicized, make it bigger, so that students who don't necessarily see the color are able to see the other elements. Don't use a dark highlight with dark text. So this example here, I mean, my eyes are bad. I don't have any sort of color blindness issues, but I have bad eyes, and this blue text on a purple background is very hard for me to read. I think it would be hard for a lot of people to read. So your accessibility checker in Canvas would definitely flag this as a color contrast issue. And don't use a light text with a light background. This is a little easier for me to read, but it's still, the text is much too light for the white background. So you always want to make sure in Canvas that your accessibility checker isn't flagging the color ratio. It'll let you know if your colors aren't working with the page. So you can pretty easily fix those issues with the accessibility checker. Okay, so headings. Headings are used to set the hierarchy for information on a page. They delineate topics and their relative importance. Screen readers can use headings to skip to specific topics or subtopics. And heading order should not be skipped. So in Canvas, H1 is actually Canvas's default for a page title. So you're not actually able to set any of your own text to header 1. So header 1's already taken by the page title in Canvas. So if you're creating, say, a lecture in Canvas, you would start with header 2. Header 2 would be your topic. And then for your subtopics, header 3. And then if you've got even more subtopics, if you're really getting detailed, you can move on to header 4. So Canvas does have 4 total. So here's just a little example of that hierarchy. You've got your page title as header 1, that's Canvas default. Your topic is header 2, your subtopics as header 3. Okay, so I said we were going to get a little more in depth with tables since we have some more time left. So I just want to go over tables real quick, Canvas table creation, and then importing tables into Canvas. So to create a Canvas table, I've got a little screenshot of how to do that here. If you don't know, in your rich content editor, you can just go to Insert, Table, choose your numbers of rows and columns, and release the mouse button, and that'll create your table. So for table width, Canvas will always set it to a default percentage, and we always recommend you maintain the percentage rather than a certain number of pixels. Our recommended width is between 90 and 100. In most of our course syllabi and things like that, we use 90%, but anywhere between 90 and 100 is fine. So the reason for using percentages over pixels is that a static pixel width can get cut off depending on your device. So if I'm creating a table with a pixel width of 800, it may look fine on my desktop, but if I switch to my phone, for example, that table could very well be cut off. If you're using a percentage, the width will adapt to any screen width. So we always just recommend percentages, again, between 90 and 100%. Canvas table does not set a default height, and you can totally leave that blank. The height's just going to adjust based on the overall height of the table. So we just recommend not specifying a height. Same with cell spacing. We recommend just leaving it blank. The cell spacing refers to the amount of space that's held between the cells in a table. If there's no reason you shouldn't use it, but we just recommend leaving it blank. There's usually not a reason to use it. Cell padding, same thing. We recommend leaving it blank. That's just the space between the cell edges and the content of the cell. So if you add padding, your content will kind of move towards the center of the cell, and there will be more padding on the sides, but we generally leave that blank. Border width has a default of 1 in Canvas, And unless you want a chunky border on your table, we just recommend sticking with that border width of 1. Okay, this is really important. So the captions. So tables created in Canvas do not default to show a caption, but they need to in order to be ADA compliant. So in your table properties in Canvas, you would just want to make sure to check the show caption box, and then it'll allow you to add a caption, which is basically just a description of what content is in the table. And if you don't add a caption that way, run the accessibility checker, it'll prompt you to enter one. Okay, so tables must have header rows. They don't always need header columns, but they must have header rows. And this is just a little breakdown to show you how to set your header rows. You can highlight your header row as I've shown here, navigate to table, row, and properties, change the row type from body to header. And again, this is just so screen readers can identify your primary information in the table, separate the headings from the data located within. Some more complex tables may require header columns. It's a little different process to specify the header columns in the rich content editor, but it's pretty simple. So again, in the rich content editor, you would just highlight your header column. You would navigate to table and then cell and cell properties. Choose the cell type to change the cell type to header, and scope from none to column. And that will indicate that your header column is headings. And I always recommend running the accessibility checker, especially if you're making a table, so that a lot of these issues, if you haven't addressed them, can be addressed. It'll flag any of those issues. And finally, if you are copying over a table from Microsoft Word, just keep in mind, it will probably come over with a width set in pixels and not in percentage. So if you've copied and pasted a table into Canvas, just make sure you change that width to percentage and not pixels. Make sure you add your border width and caption, and your table should be good to go. Okay, and finally, our ASTIC course is available under a CC license. So if any of you would like to see the course, you can always reach out to us at dg_onlineoffice@barstow.edu. And that is all I have for that. So let me stop sharing my screen. And I thank you guys for your time.
Thank you, Adrian. And that's a perfect segue for the next presentation. So let me share. Okay. So thank you, Adrian, for teaching us about LATCH and how we can use this acronym to remember accessibility principles in Canvas and in web accessibility. So everyone, if you're just joining in, as a reminder, please hold all questions until the end. Our Q&A session for both presentations, Barstow Community College, and then up now, MiraCosta, will begin at approximately 3:15 a.m. after MiraCosta presentation has concluded. All right, it is still recording? Okay, perfect. All right, so next up is MiraCosta College with the presentation, Always a Work in Progress, Creating a Culture of Equitable Access. So this session is presented by Aaron Holmes, Access Specialist at the Student Accessibility Services, Jeff Higginbotham, Faculty Director at the Student Accessibility Services, Jim Julius, Faculty Director of Online Education, and Michelle Farnham, Counselor at the Student Accessibility Services. As a reminder, please hold all questions to the end, and then we'll conclude with the Q&A section. So let me stop screen sharing. And MiraCosta, take it away.
Looks great.
Okay, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us today, and thanks for inviting us. Our title is Always a Work in Progress, Creating a Culture of Equitable Access. When we were approached to present, a few of us got together and we started talking about the efforts that we've made specific to accessibility and equitable access. And we started listing off a number of things that we were very proud of, happy with, but obviously identified a lot of areas where we're still looking to improve. So that's kind of the theme of our presentation. So I'll get started with kind of a brief intro. We provide our email addresses here, certainly to be accessed at a later time. If anybody has any questions, concerns, or if they like any resources that we're able to share as well. So just briefly, again, my name is Jeff Higginbotham. I'm the faculty director for Student Accessibility Services at MiraCosta. For context, Student Accessibility Services is similar to a DSPS or other program you have on your campus, responsible for authorizing accommodations for students with disabilities. Before I turn it over to other members of our college, I want to provide some general information regarding MiraCosta College as it relates to efforts involving accessibility and equity-minded practices. First, training resources, individual support and dialogue involving accessibility and equity-minded practices are provided and occur throughout the year, but like many colleges, probably more intensive during flex or professional development weeks. Discussion and work related to accessibility isn't reserved only for specific committees or work groups. It really is baked in to discussions and campus projects based upon awareness about accessibility that's been developed over many years through campus-wide trainings. Second, accountability and commitment to support these efforts are truly shared across the instructional, student service, and administrative divisions. For example, while the campus has an access specialist through the Student Accessibility Services department, the responsibility to ensure accessibility doesn't rest upon him entirely. He's consulted initially and throughout development cycles of programs or projects, but not just when a problem is identified or at the end immediately before launch. We're happy with the progress we've made. We acknowledge there are areas still needing improvement, and I think like many, we learn best when an issue is identified and needs to be resolved, and certainly from colleagues at other institutions. Our work involving equity and accessibility is a work in progress and by no means perfect. Examples included in the workshop highlight a few of the efforts we're presently engaged in. We hope they can help you develop or affirm efforts you're making. And obviously, we're happy to answer questions during the presentation or offline, separate from the workshop. So with that, I'll turn it over to Student Accessibility Services Counselor, Michelle Farnham.
Hi, everyone. I'm Michelle Farnham, and I'm going to talk about our Ability Ally training. So I don't know about your schools, but we have a lot of Ally trainings going on, and we certainly wanted to hop on board and make sure that our the students in our office, in our program, were also being acknowledged, and that our staff and faculty had the opportunity to get to know more about disabilities and the students that we're serving on campus. So with that, we offered a 6-week Canvas course as professional development for our staff and faculty. We also, I think, added administrators to that list as well. So if anybody wants to learn, we'll take them. And what we did is we so every 6 weeks, we had a discussion board for reflection and just the opportunity to engage on that topic that we provided for the week. And then we finished up the whole 6 weeks with a live, we did an in-person student panel, and these are students from our SAS office, just to kind of wrap it up. Okay, next slide. So I just want to show you the breakdown of what we did each week, just to, if you need some ideas. Ours, this is just what worked for us, and the what we did each week was a flow for us and what we wanted, but it can certainly change. But week 1, we talked about Ability Ally, what that means, what it looks like, how that's presented to students on campus. and what that looks like on campus. And week number 2, we talked about diversity and disability, and pretty much that diversity includes disability. So just acknowledging that. And week 3, we had a breakdown of disabilities more in detail of the students that we serve, the disabilities that we are providing accommodations for. And then what we did is we provided some scenarios of, as if a student does this or says this, how would you handle that in your ally, in an ally fashion, right? So engaging in some exchange of examples, encouragement, opportunities to learn what to do as an ally. So that was a good week for people to engage in that topic and share what they've used, what works, what hasn't worked as well too. Okay, next slide. Week 4 this is where we talked about the laws, ADA, disability rights movement. We provided the link to Crip Camp. If you haven't seen that wonderful movie about the disability rights movement, kind of tied everything into what we covered in week 4. Week 5, we discussed, so there are other things that we also wanted to do. We wanted to make sure we kind of touched a little bit on some different topics. We didn't go too in depth, but just so that staff and faculty had knowledge, right, of some of these topics. So that was barriers, ableism, and microaggressions. And then week 6, this is our final week, we reviewed the inclusive language. We wanted to explore a little bit of that social versus medical model. Definitely want to tie in that UDL and best practices for people to use on campus and in their classrooms. And then again, we had that live student panel. We had SAS students who were very happy to volunteer, share their experiences, and engage with faculty and staff, answer their questions. We did it in person. We also had it Zoomed. We were kind of getting out of the pandemic at that time, so offering different opportunities for people to engage. So that was our highlight of our of our ally weeks, because everybody learned all of this, and now they were able to engage actually with somebody that they might be seeing in their classrooms or around campus. So that we thought was a good opportunity. Next slide, thank you. So definitely some hurdles, some things that we had to kind of figure out along the way. We're still figuring it out, let me tell you. It is a process, but what the first part, right, is who's going to do it? We have a small office, and you guys might have small offices as well. So who's going to create the training? Because that takes a lot of work. And it ended up that there were 3 of us, 2 of our staff members in the office and myself as a faculty member, put the training together. And then kind of dividing that up, the training, who has that time and availability to create it, to actually learn the program if you don't know how to use the Canvas program that we used, which we needed a little training for that. And then where are we finding, how are we going to put the modules together? Where are we going to find the content? So that took a lot of time to create the training. And then we also had a discussion board each week. So who was monitoring that? So these were kind of things that we really needed to acknowledge and to have in place before. And we kind of did it on the fly too, like, oh gosh, okay, discussion boards, what are we going to do? Who's going to do it? How are we going to divvy this up so that one person isn't maintaining it all and we all have a part of it. So those were some things that we had to work on. Next slide. And then we wanted to make sure that after we put all this hard work together, who was going to do it? Who's going to take our training? So we wanted to create that interest and make sure that we had enough people that wanted to take the opportunity. We would go to any meeting that we went to. We would hype it up. We sent out like a save the date email just to get people's curiosity engaged. Anybody we talked to, we would just let them know that it was coming. So we had think at the end we had plenty of interest, but in the beginning, you know, you don't know who's going to be interested in it. And then participating. So we had some, mostly all online, but we did have a few in-person opportunities for people that wanted to be in person. So who was going to participate and were they going to do it was another issue. So trying to create some in-person opportunities that didn't work out very well just because of, I think, coming out of the COVID, and we didn't have a lot of people on campus, but we did try. We wanted to make that engagement. But then also online, we had a lot of content where people going to go to the discussion boards. There was a lot of monitoring that needed to be involved in the discussion boards, making sure people were participating, because that's something that can easily just be skipped and gone on to the next module. So just really trying to make sure that people are participating and learning what we want them to learn, right, or engaging in that material. And then the time spent in each module, this wasn't really something we thought about in the beginning, but what we found out is that there's, you know, people can put in different time amounts and think that they've finished the the training. So when you look at it, it looked like maybe somebody spent for the whole 6 weeks, maybe 2 hours total, you know, just a little bit of time in each module. And then other people were over and above with 20, 25 hours. So it, you know, we're thinking of ways to be able to figure that out as far as monitoring the time. We ended up opening all 6 modules at once, and I don't think that worked out very well. We want people to be able to spend time in each module per week and really kind of take it in. So we're just going to open one module at a time now. They can go back to the other modules, but not forward. So anyway, that was just something we needed to work on. And let's talk about successes, because we were very happy that it went well. The first training, we had 20 people, participants finish the training, and just to let you know too, we opened it again for the second time, and we had 40 participants enroll in the training in about an hour and a half. So we were very excited about that. But this first training, we had about 35 participants start, and we know that people are busy. It's a busy time at schools, right? So we ended up having 20 complete, and we're very happy about that. And we do have people looking forward to starting again and getting on the wait list for if we have it again. So we gotta look at that. And then the other thing that we kind of hear might be in the works is for our onboarding new faculty members. We have heard that it might be a possibility to incorporate the Ability Ally training in with this new onboarding. So having all the new faculty members go through this training right up front, so they have this awareness of who's going to be, you know, who they might see in their classes and about our program. And then the other thing that we're happy to say too is it's just another way for us to support our students. So we are engaging faculty and staff on campus to open their eyes to new things, think out of the box when dealing with students, and just being open to helping, maybe having a little more empathy, being comfortable with students that they might see on campus that are using our SAS office. So we're happy that we have another way to support students. And we're, like I said, we're doing our second time. This is our second go around, and we have a lot of things to update and change and monitor. So again, just a work in progress, but we're happy to offer the training. So I think I'm done. And whoever is next, go for it. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jim, and I'm the Faculty Director of Online Education at MiraCosta. I took a spin through the participant list, and I see a lot of my distance education colleagues from around the system. Very cool to see you here. And, you know, as the DE coordinator for MiraCosta, I've always believed that there's opportunities when it comes to online and distance education to become a leader. And sometimes that's a matter of the innovation that's inherent in teaching online. Sometimes that's a matter of additional laws, regulations, and accreditor expectations that get put on distance education, right? So For me, I'm on the instructional services side of the house, but very much believe in partnership with my colleagues in student ability services and other areas of student support. And so we're a team in really trying to move this culture. We're a team in doing a lot of very specific things, but kind of the big picture as well. So one of the things related to big picture when it comes to the online side is our policies or procedures that relate to distance education. So AP 4105 is the typical AP. If you're not familiar with that, I encourage you to take a look at what your local college's administrative procedure, maybe board policy, but probably administrative procedure on distance education looks like. But first and foremost, it's about guiding how you approve curriculum for offering via distance education. So there's a course level commitment that you can see in here that's inherent. And basically that guides our curriculum committee when a course comes to the committee to be approved for offering via distance education, that we need to make sure that the other elements of that course outline of record don't seem to conflict with the possibility of offering that fully online in an accessible fashion. So I think one thing that often is expressed by faculty at the distance education who are involved in distance education is that like all the burdens on them. So if we can go to the next slide, you can see that we also decided to make a statement about institutional commitment in this same AP, in our distance education AP. So we use the language, by the way, defining accessibility that is straight from the new Title V regulations on distance education. That language was proposed over a year ago, but just was finally approved back in November. So if your college has not yet updated your local policies and procedures around distance education to reflect those Title V changes, this is one piece that as accessibility advocates, I'd encourage you to make sure is updated as well. And then, just the idea here is make sure that we know that we have something to point to when we're asking the college to provide support, whether it's support in the selection of tools, whether it's support of the faculty and in making sure that things are accessible, but that it's not just a burden on faculty, it's really an institutional commitment. Next slide. So I'll also point out at MiraCosta, I know a lot of colleges have very extensive requirements for training for faculty teaching online. MiraCosta is not a college like that. We have had very minimal requirements. We did recently have our unions and district negotiate an agreement for a 3-hour training, but I'm really glad that part of that training is just awareness of those accessibility expectations. It certainly is not a training that would fully prepare somebody to create all of their content accessibly, but it helps them become aware of the expectation, the requirement, the regulations, the local expectations, but also the local support. So where do they go to learn more? How do they begin to actually follow those expectations? So that is now built in and will be going forward. Next slide. So I think it's also helpful to know as part of this culture shift at the institution, we're not like Barstow. That I was really impressed to hear Barstow has 3 instructional design specialists. Up until about a year and a half ago, we had no instructional designers at MiraCosta. We did have some short-term temporary contracts to provide that kind of support to faculty. But at long last, this position was approved, and part of the core element of those duties that are in that job description are supporting faculty with accessibility. So this is a position that reports directly to our Vice President of Instructional Services, but they become a partner with SAS, with my area, and with other professional development folks at the college in advancing accessibility. Next slide. So kind of putting some of these pieces together and just talking about instruction generally, this is very much a partnership. So I hope that you feel like you have partners and you're not on your own, but I think that's part of the culture shift, is to make sure that you do have partners across the institution and thinking about this at a culture change level. Sometimes in distance education, in particular, we get, really focused on diving deep with the person who is sort of in the spotlight, the course that's in the spotlight. And we, like with the poker, for example, if your college is doing poker, you're doing some really, really thorough accessibility reviews, but maybe on a very small subset of courses. MiraCosta is kind of taking the other approach, which is broad culture change that will eventually be really touching everybody. So a variety of different workshops, resources, and trainings that we all collaborate on and offer regularly. Although Aaron Holmes hasn't presented yet, he's a really important partner with faculty, with our instructional designer, in offering some of those trainings to faculty, in working directly alongside faculty when that's necessary. We also have individual departments that are very engaged with me, with SAS, like math, for example. They know that there are a lot of challenges in offering math accessibly online. So they're always asking for help, vetting tools, implementing tools, helping faculty use those in the right ways to make sure that they're accessible. And so those departmental connections are also really important. We do have a course review program in development right now that will include an accessibility component. We're hoping to make it simple enough and effective enough that faculty can do it almost themselves and then have peers come alongside without requiring an instructional designer or an accessibility expert to sign off on every review, but yet to catch the vast majority of accessibility issues that we know are the ones that are most likely to trip up the accessibility of a course for the vast majority of our students. And I also want to mention too, another opportunity that many colleges are looking at right now are the zero textbook cost grant funds that are coming from the state. If you know what I'm talking about, that's been a little bit delayed, or maybe a lot delayed, but we're hoping that once those grant funds are released, it's going to create another opportunity to advance the accessibility agenda. If your college is taking advantage of those funds, there's some pretty clear requirements that anything that's developed, any course materials that are created around zero textbook cost resources need to be shared, but they also need to be completely compliant with accessibility requirements. So couple that requirement with all those funds and make sure that you build in additional support for making sure that everything developed through those grants are 100% accessible. And that, again, just helps more and more folks get touched with what it means to create things from the beginning to be accessible, and to support going back maybe to previous zero textbook and OER courses that didn't have that thorough of support, but use those funds to go back and revisit them, make sure that they're accessible. So that's an important part of what we're doing in setting our foundation to hopefully begin to receive some of that grant money pretty soon this spring.
And then also wanted to talk about, I'm Aaron Holmes and I'm the access specialist here at MiraCosta. So I wanted to talk about how our commitment to accessibility and equity across campus is within our procurement process and also improving, hopefully, within our procurement process as we look at making it even better than we currently have it as far as different types of checks for compliance. So if anybody saw the presentation earlier on procurement that was held today, absolutely excellent. And there's some commonality here, but then there's also some places we want to go that would give us a more accessible or more a process that makes more of our products not just accessible but also usable. I think that's one of the things that we're looking at here. So we do a 508 compliance check, usually through a VPAT or some sort of testing of the product. If it's a larger product that has an RFP involved, then I'm usually invited into that process during the RFP to be there to check on the compliance with firsthand knowledge rather than just relying on what I would usually call like secondhand knowledge of something like a VPAT or something that might not give us the whole picture. The other thing that we're looking at is not just the strict 508 compliance, but how usable is it for a student? And not just students with disabilities, but all students maybe who might not have the technology that we expect them to have, or that some people think that they have, and things like that. So baking in the usability and the accessibility rather than just looking at it as a requirement for some sort of legal aspect of it. And another part of our process that we have right now is, rather than just saying yes, it's accessible or no, it's not, we also look to determine what sort of either accommodations or situations we should be aware of, or our faculty, especially if they're teaching, should be aware of, that students might run into, depending on the tool that it is and how we're going to use it. So we had, just one example is we had recently a spectrometer that was purchased. We could not find a way to give access to somebody who was legally blind to the spectrometer. It was a very specific use case in research. So we talked to the faculty and determined what the actual use of the spectrometer would be on campus, how they were going to use it in the course, and what the course's kind of expectations were through the course outline of record, and already have in place a way to make the content accessible and the learning available to the student if there were a student who was legally blind in that course that uses that spectrometer. And then, like we've kind of talked about throughout the presentation, it's always a work in progress, especially with accessibility or usability. You're never going to get it perfect, but you want to keep making steps forward. And so in our technology plan, we want to improve our accessibility review process, but also codify it, because currently our process is more of an informal process. It was set up a few years ago, and we're following it for many cases, but there are some products and some pieces of equipment that fall through the cracks because it's not something that we have in writing or that's required in our current procurement process. So that's part of our technology plan to actually codify that and improve it.
And then lastly, with the time remaining, I think we were just going to kind of highlight a few things. This isn't an all-inclusive list, but a few things from a broader institutional perspective, in addition to what Jim and Aaron shared, and separate from kind of student services, where Michelle described our Ability Ally. Yeah, we have a new position, a very important position, as Associate Vice President, Chief Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility Officer. Fortunately, this individual came from a student services background and had some awareness of, actually a broad awareness and understanding of students with disabilities. But this position is placed organizationally within close proximity to the president, with the VPSS and VPI, and will be charged with kind of coordinating, overseeing, and evaluating various efforts and data points as far as students serving a broad range of students. And we're still figuring out the accessibility piece. And that's the part I love, is that she is inviting Aaron into these discussions, and not just as kind of a guest, but as a core participant as part of some of the committees that she will be overseeing. Our information technology services, or kind of IT department, they work closely with SAS, but also independently. They're oftentimes that we find that they are working kind of autonomously to ensure that there's accessibility in our libraries and other campus computer labs. Through one example, at least for us, and within kind of DSPS programs or SAS programs, in which we see benefit, is when the college supports paying for and funding certain types of things separate from the DSPS allocation. That comes back to support us in the institution later on, but they support institutional licenses of Fusion and Kurzweil, as well as they help in the organization and coordination of quiet spaces in libraries for students with sensory disabilities. Facilities collaborates with SAS and Aaron a great deal. This is one example where they work with and invite Aaron to meetings involving digital campus wayfinding. Student life, there are, as many of you are aware, responsibilities specific to commencement and other types of public events and student events. So they work closely with SAS and information technology services to ensure that the commencement and other activities are accessible, both physically, but also with digital and electronic formats. And they're also very interested. So student affairs, student groups are interested in learning, and Aaron offers training to support accessible social media content. So we kind of have a rule, so to speak, informally that goes about that if you're posting something related to or on a MiraCosta youth social media site or app, that it needs to be accessible. And not just it needs to be, but here are the reasons why. So we provide a lot of the why, which I think lands a little bit differently. And then lastly, within student services, we have a number of changes, like I'm sure a lot of colleges and moving from different kind of student database programs. So our CRM programs, Aaron is invited to these types of discussions during the development at the initial stages. So not at the end of then asking, hey, is this accessible? And now how do we fix it? Being a part of those conversations at the very beginning. And then separately, we have a social justice and equity center. It's awesome. Within our campus, they help coordinate and fund history, heritage, and awareness campaigns to include those focused on accessibility as well. So these are a few examples of efforts that we're undertaking across the institution broadly. But I don't know, I'm very fortunate to work with folks like Jim and obviously Aaron and Michelle, but Jim, separate from SAS, he's able to articulate his understanding and advocate for the accessibility of programs, distance ed programs, and be part of kind of that team. So these are examples from our college, and kind of ends our presentation, but we're open to questions you might have or anything we can do to support you and learn from you as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff and MiraCosta team. I think your presentation was fantastic, and it really does show that it takes a village to build an accessible and inclusive campus community, right? So now with the time remaining, we'll open up the floor for any questions for MiraCosta's presentation or Barstow Community College presentation. So you can either enter them in the chat, unmute yourself, or use the raise hand feature. It looks like we have one question. Jason?
Yeah, I had a question from an earlier presentation. I got the email for them, but I'm not sure as to I'll have to go back into the chat. I believe it was from Barstow, and then that was an ACE IT course. Is that correct?
That's right. It's our ASTIC course. It's our training course that we offer for accessibility principles. I did put our email address in the chat, but I can just post it again so you don't have to scroll back, and you can feel free to reach out to us if you'd like to see that course content.
Yeah, that would be great. And then, and two, if I'm pronouncing or spelling it right, too, the ACE IT, is it AC? Like I aced the course?
Aced it, yes, exactly. ACED IT. That's right. Yep.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
How is your curriculum committee working through the DE addendums for accessibility?
So Lori, our DE addendum is fairly straightforward. I know there's a lot of variability in DE addendums across the system. Some, are very, very detailed. For ours, it's really just a simple, almost like a checkbox, that if a department is submitting a course to be offered as distance education, they're verifying that they are committed to offering it accessibly. And so the curriculum committee has a fairly straightforward job, which is simply to review the course outline of record whenever anything is proposed to be offered via distance education, and say, is there anything inherent to this course outline of record that seems like it'll be problematic when it's offered online? And that could be in terms of accessibility or in terms of other aspects of just what is expected to be taught in that class. But for the most part, at this point, the curriculum committee it's not verifying anything technical when it comes to accessibility. It's just verifying the possibility that that course can be offered accessibly. The implementation of that course is another matter, but that's really beyond the purview of the curriculum committee.
Okay, I think that's the next mountain to climb, especially based on the ASCCC's curriculum documents that they've created about DEIA. And so it's something that we're working on here locally, but I'm just curious how other colleges are also approaching it.
Yeah, I understand what you're talking about. I just think it's important to me. It's important for us not to confuse curriculum, course outlines of record, and courses and programs with what faculty implement and create. And I agree there needs to be checks on both sides of that, but I don't think putting up front in the curriculum process the requirement to prove that something is accessible makes sense, because unless your college has agreed to greatly constrain the options that faculty have when they teach a class, most colleges want to retain a lot of freedom for faculty in how they implement that course outline of record. So there has to be something further along in the process that to me is on the other side of curriculum. It's really in the offering of classes, the developing of the courses, and all of that, where that support and that checking needs to lie.
I think that might be the next a presentation looking at that process, because we'll see a lot of variation across the system.
All right, I think I have one question that came directly to me. How often do you offer the Ability Ally training?
So we've offered it once in the spring of last year. And again, we had a good turnout. We accepted 35 participants, ended up with 20. And this is our second go around this spring. And we capped it at 40 participants this time. And it just depending on our time and availability, we may offer it maybe in the fall, I don't know, but at least once a year in the spring. Thank you.
Looks like I got one. MiraCosta, could you tell us a little bit more about how accessibility intersects with the zero textbook cost work that you guys are doing?
Yeah, so I mentioned that so right now, as I mentioned, we have sort of a task. Well, I don't think I mentioned, but we're as an institution really focused on what's going to what will happen when the statewide zero textbook cost grant funds are made available. And so we have a task force. That task force includes Aaron as a representative of SAS, so that we're constantly thinking about, when we develop our processes for building out zero textbook cost courses and programs, how do we bake in that those are going to be created accessibly from the ground up? So that's, just involving Aaron is a big part of that process. and making sure that that's constantly part of the conversation. And as I mentioned, also just reminding folks that even if you already have courses that are OER based or are zero textbook cost, we might not have done the level of accessibility checking that we would have wanted to. And there's an opportunity here with these funds to go back and touch those classes, get them really checked thoroughly to make sure that they are ready to become part of a ZTC program that's in compliance with these grant requirements.
Well, I thought it was a great presentation. I think you're right, Jim. It just shows the amount of effort that everyone is putting in based on their area of assignment on campus, but also a little bit more and rethinking how we're approaching services to students, services to faculty, how we slice out budget pie. And I think the future challenges have to do with, as we've heard, professional development, distance ed, student services. We're all in it at this point and trying to figure out who's doing what is going to be our next hurdle.
All right, any last minute Bernie questions, anything you want to ask? Feel free, now's your time. Use the chat or use the raise hand feature. Yes, Anna.
Hello, everyone. It's just I'm the alternate media and assistive technology specialist at San Bernardino Valley College. And one thing that I come across through the years and keep going is that faculty are not posting the title of books, ISBN numbers, author, and editions to the bookstores. And this includes even the free sources of books. So when we're creating alternate media, we try to get ahead of the game and there's no information there. So something needs to happen across the state or something that students have that information, even regardless that they need audiobooks, they need to know what books they need to start their classes. So something to think about. Thank you.
And I think that's a great comment because I also am responsible for making sure that our students get that material. And while we've got some things that I didn't know, it's been getting a little bit more common here. If anybody is using Follett for their bookstore, know that they can add notes into there with a URL to the digital material. So it's starting to become a little bit more common. It's not common enough. But they are able to add the URL to any digital material in that notes section. It's called notes, at least on our Follett site. So that helps me and the people making alt media here significantly. And it also, like you said, lets the student know what is required, because sometimes they assume that there isn't going to be any book material and they don't contact us because the bookstore says no books, but then really they have a PDF file that's 700 or 800 pages deep that they need to read.
Corrine, I think we can take your question offline. I don't know as if it's really for MiraCosta and Barstow, so I can follow up with you offline. We'll have somebody follow up with you, Corrine, on the DECT grant.
All right, if there are no more questions, I guess this concludes this portion and the winter workshop. I do have a few more slides to share just regarding about upcoming accessibility center events. Thank you again, MiraCosta and Barstow Community College, for presenting.
Thank you.
All right, so thank you everyone for attending our winter workshop. We encourage you all to complete our post-workshop survey. So all feedback is welcome. Let us know what worked, what didn't work, any topics you want to see more of, and any topics you didn't see and you want to see. So we have some exciting upcoming events in store for you this year. We have our accessibility office hours, February 9th, with how the California Community College Accessibility Center offers 504 resources. We will also be having our next CCC Community of Accessibility Allies, also known as C4A2 meeting on February 15th. The Accessibility Center as the community of allies to promote inclusion and campus accessibility among California community colleges through collaboration, networking, and sharing of best practices within web, digital content, procurement, DSPS, and alt media. Our next meeting is February 15th from 10:30 to 11:30 a.m. I will be inserting registration link and our listserv for that group in the chat. Additionally, we have on March 1st, Shire Basics, Introduction to Closed Captioning. So this live training will introduce and discuss the basics of Shire, our new browser-based captioning editor. On March 3rd, we have Accessibility for STEM and Math. So join us in these upcoming trainings. Additionally, our contact information, here's how to reach us. The presentations and recordings will be available in the near future, so stay alert. Our website is cccaccessibility.org, or for any questions, you can email us at accessibility@ccctechcenter.org. And we also have our LinkedIn channel, CCC Accessibility Center. So that concludes our winter workshop. Thank you all for attending and have a great rest of your afternoon.